Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into, well, a massive conflict, Great Britain versus revolutionary Napoleonic France. But we're looking at it through a specific lens. Sea power, naval strategy, and maybe most importantly, economic endurance.
Exactly. We're really leaning on the analysis of Alfred Thayer Mahan here, the sort of foundational thinker on sea power. And the core idea, really, is that while Napoleon was this absolute genius on land,
Undeniably.
Britain's control of the seas wasn't just, helpful. It was the decisive factor. It systematically choked, isolated, and ultimately forced Napoleon's empire into this fatal overreach.
So for you, the listener, our mission today isn't just listing battles. We want to synthesize that all the campaigns, like Trafalgar, but also the big strategic decisions, the Continental System, the internal collapse of the French Navy itself.
We're aiming for that aha moment,
Yeah.
that point where you see exactly why Napoleon, the master of Europe, just couldn't overcome this island nation protected by its fleet.
Okay, so let's lay out the core thesis up front, drawing from Mahan. This wasn't a quick fight. It became this long, grinding struggle of endurance.
Right. Think of it as two fortresses, almost impregnable in their own domains. France, dominant on the continent with Grand Army. Britain, unassailable at sea with the Royal Navy.
And the British key to winning this long game.
Achieving security, protecting themselves and their trade by causing the exhaustion of the enemy. Sea power let Britain dictate the pace, project force where it chose, and just wait. Wait until France's resources simply ran out.
Okay, so to really get why the British Navy kept winning, we need to look at the French side first. And it starts with a bit of a paradox, doesn't it?
It really does. Look, at the start of the war, say 1793, France has 76 ships of the line. Britain has 115. Okay, Britain has more, but it's not like an overwhelming difference in hulls.
And the French ships themselves, weren't they often technically very good?
Absolutely. French naval design was often top-notch. Their ships could be faster, sometimes better armed. Mahan points out the total weight of a French broadside was only about a sixth less than the British total. On paper, this looks like a serious force.
I mean, if they'd held their own against the British just years before, during the American Revolution.
Exactly. So the wood, the iron, the cannons, that wasn't the fundamental problem.
So what was, if the hardware was okay?
It was the software, the people, and specifically the chaos the revolution unleashed on the naval personnel. A ship of the line back then. It's maybe the most complex bit of technology and organization around.
Requires incredible skill, coordination.
Decades of it. Navigation, gunnery, complex fleet maneuvers under sail. Mahan calls a ship a mobile battery handled by an organic body whose members are mutually dependent. The revolution just shattered that organic body.
Okay, let's unpack organic body. What happens when that breaks down in a navy?
Everything falls apart. The trust, the skills passed down. Gone. Naval command needs hierarchy. Specialized skills, knowing how to handle sails in a storm, coordinating dozens of guns, repairing damage mid-fight. You don't learn that from revolutionary pamphlets.
Right.
So when the experienced aristocratic officers were purged or fled, that institutional knowledge just evaporated. Poof.
A whole professional class just wiped out, so the officers left behind, they must have been massively out of their depth.
Hugely. I mean, look at the Battle of the glorious 1st of June, 1794. It's almost funny if it wasn't so tragic. The commander, Villeray-Joyeuse, he was only a lieutenant just 3 years earlier, in 91.
Wow.
And his captains. Many were former sub-lieutenants, guys who captained merchant ships, even former boatswains, suddenly in command of these massive warships. They might have known trade routes, but commanding a battle line against professionals. Completely different universe.
And it wasn't just the officers, right? The revolutionary ideas like equality, they seeped down into the crews and wrecked discipline too.
Oh, absolutely. That's where the organic body really started bleeding internally. This focus on, ideological purity over rank. It led to rampant mutiny.
You mentioned San Domingo.
Yeah, there are reports of crews just deciding they had the right to judge their own officers. Imagine trying to command a ship, facing the enemy, knowing your crew might just decide to overrule you. Or worse, it's paralyzing. Effective command becomes impossible.
And this whole mess directly feeds into Napoleon's, frankly, wrong ideas about naval warfare. He was a land guy through and through.
Totally.
Yeah.
On land, speed, morale, audacity, they can often win the day. He tried to just paste that onto the Navy.
The infamous cult of audacity.
Exactly. Napoleon seemed to genuinely think that raw courage was all that mattered at sea. He ignored the years of training, the organization, the seamanship required. He thought the British were just complacent. And if he could just find a few French admirals willing to be incredibly brave, willing to die heroically.
Then Britain's naval superiority would just melt away.
Pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds heroic in a way, but it's completely detached from the realities of naval warfare. A shift of the line isn't a cavalry charge.
Right, it's a floating fortress that needs immense coordination.
And this put terrible pressure on the few competent French officers who were left, the ones who knew better, like Admiral Villeneuve.
The commander at Trafalgar.
Yes. He knew what Napoleon expected, this almost suicidal aggression. But he also knew his crews weren't up to it. There's that quote, dripping with irony, where he says, well, since the emperor thinks only audacity is needed, he'll leave nothing to be desired.
He knew it was hopeless, but he had to try anyway.
He knew. And that knowledge, that clarity about his own fleet's weaknesses, it just crippled his ability to take necessary risks. He was trapped by his own professional understanding, condemned by it, really.
And the results of all this internal rot were obvious at sea, in actual performance.
Oh, immediately. The sources are full of examples. Gunnery, for instance. Terrible. You'd have whole French broadsides firing big clouds of smoke, but doing less actual damage than maybe 2 well-aimed British guns.
Because the crews just weren't drilled.
Exactly. Gunnery on a rolling ship takes constant practice. Months, years. The French just hadn't had the stability or discipline to do it properly.
And the basic seamanship suffered too. You mentioned that story about Morard de Gaull's flagship. Tell us about that. It really drives the point home.
It's incredibly telling. Admiral Morard de Gaulle, in a storm, needs to wear a ship, basically turn it safely away from the wind. A fundamental maneuver.
Should be routine, right?
Absolutely. But he couldn't do it. Why? Because he couldn't get even 30 sailors on deck who knew how or were willing to handle the sails and rigging properly. Maybe they were sick, untrained, mutinous. Who knows? The point is, the basic function was gone.
If you can't even turn your ship in a storm.
How on earth are you going to execute complex battle maneuvers?
Yeah.
Maintain formation under fire, coordinate with other ships? You can't. This internal collapse, years before Trafalgar, essentially sealed the fate of the French Navy and any major fleet action.
Right.
#tag3, crucial naval turning points.
Okay, so the French Navy is falling apart from the inside. Meanwhile, the British aren't without their own problems. Mutinies were a real threat for them too, but the key difference seems to be leadership, like Sir John Jervis, later Lord St. Vincent.
Jervis is the absolute counterpoint to the French chaos. He understood that naval power relies utterly on efficiency, and efficiency relies on absolute discipline. No compromise.
He took command during a really shaky period, right? 1797, the Spithead and Nore mutinies.
Exactly. The mutinous spirit wasn't just a French problem. But Jervis, well, the sources say he used iron hands. And he did. He took a fleet teetering on the edge of dissolution and forged it back into this sharp, effective fighting force.
That story about the execution on HMS Marlborough, it's chilling, but it shows just how far he was willing to go.
It's the ultimate demonstration of resolve, isn't it?
Mm.
He needed to execute a mutiny ringleader on the Marlborough in '97, right in the middle of all this unrest. He knew that Marlborough's crew might resist.
So what did he do?
He prepared for the worst. He ordered armed launches crewed by loyal officers and gunners to surround the Marlborough, and his orders were crystal clear. If that crew showed any sign of resistance, any attempt to stop the execution,
Yes.
the launches were to sink the Marlborough immediately, with everyone on board, captain, crew, everyone.
Sink their own ship in front of the whole fleet.
That was the message. Utterly ruthless, yes, but Jervis knew naval discipline was Britain's lifeline. If that broke, everything broke.
And it worked.
It worked. The execution went ahead. No resistance. Jervis apparently just turned and said, "Discipline is preserved, sir." The psychological shockwave through the fleet must have been immense. It wasn't just about punishment. It was about an unbreakable commitment to the service's function. That hard edge created the reliable tool Nelson needed.
And that tool, that efficiency, allowed for higher-level strategic thinking. Which brings us to Nelson and the Copenhagen Campaign in 1801. This really shows the gap between just being technically correct and being strategically brilliant.
Right, it's a fascinating moment. You've got the Northern League, Russia, Sweden, Denmark threatening British Baltic trade. Nelson's boss, Admiral Parker, is very cautious. He doesn't want to attack Russia directly, even though they're the main power.
Why not?
Because he was worried about leaving Denmark potentially hostile in his rear. Tactically, keeping your lines of communication secure makes sense. It's technically correct naval practice.
But strategically short-sighted.
That's what Nelson thought. He saw past the immediate tactical problem. He had this great
A
analogy.
good analogy.
Yeah. He said the Northern League was like a tree. Tsar Paul of Russia. He's the trunk. Sweden and Denmark. They're just the branches.
So Parker wanted to trim the branches.
While Nelson argued passionately, go for the trunk, strike Russia directly, specifically hit their fleet at Revel, where half of it was iced in and vulnerable. Destroy the trunk, he said, and the branches will wither on their own.
Makes perfect sense strategically.
It does. But Parker stuck to his cautious by-the-book approach. Mahan calls Parker's decision pedantic. Technically right, but missing the bigger strategic win. It shows Nelson's genius, that leap from just managing ships to seeing the whole strategic picture, even when his superiors didn't.
But Nelson's genius was unleashed later spectacularly at the Battle of the Nile in 1798. This wasn't just winning, it was annihilation. It completely wrecked Napoleon's plans in the East.
The Nile is almost a laboratory dissection of how to exploit an enemy's errors. The French admiral, Brueys, anchored his fleet in Aboukir Bay. He thought he was safe, lined up parallel to the shore. His big mistake.
He didn't secure his flank properly.
Exactly. He assumed the shallow water on his shoreward side, the van of his line, would stop the British from getting around him. He left a gap.
And Nelson saw it instantly.
Nelson saw it, and crucially, his captains were trained to think aggressively like him. The lead British ship, HMS Goliath, just sailed right into that gap inside the French line. Other ships followed.
Catching the French completely off guard.
Totally. Suddenly, the leading French ships were being hit from both sides, the seaward side they expected, and the shoreward side they thought was safe. It was a death trap.
And this goes back to the internal French problems again, right? The lack of preparation.
Absolutely. The sources say the French were so sure nobody could get inside their line, the cannons on that side weren't even properly ready for action. They were cluttered with ropes, storage, daily ship stuff.
Choked with the encumbrances of ship economy, I think was the phrase.
That's it. So when Nelson's ship slipped inside, they just poured devastating fire into unprepared opponents. It was a slaughter. 9 French battleships taken or destroyed. Brueys himself killed. Game over.
And the immediate impact for Napoleon back in Egypt.
Stranded. His whole army, 30,000 strong, cut off.
Yeah.
Mahan makes the point brilliantly. Napoleon attacked in extremity, trying to threaten India via Egypt, but Nelson severed his lifeline. The British heart, their home islands, their trade remained untouched. Napoleon was stuck.
His grand oriental vision crushed by sea power.
Exactly. And it wasn't just fleet actions. Naval power could reach onto land too, like at the Siege of Acre.
Ah, yes, Sir Sidney Smith.
A classic example of sea power's flexibility. Napoleon needed Acre to advance into Syria, maybe threaten India overland. But the defense, led by Smith, held out. Why?
Because Smith captured Napoleon's siege guns.
Precisely. The heavy artillery Napoleon needed to breach Acre's walls was being shipped up the coast from Egypt. Smith's squadron intercepted the convoy, captured the guns, and then, ironically, even used some of them to help defend Acre against Napoleon.
Wow, talk about adding insult to injury.
Right. Denied his essential heavy artillery, Napoleon's siege stalled. He had to withdraw from Syria. His land campaign halted decisively by a naval interception of his logistics. Sea power held the ultimate veto.
Okay, so Egypt's a failure, the East is closed off. Napoleon's focus narrows down to the one big prize, invading Britain itself. He knew he had to do it, that famous quote.
Masters of the Strait for 6 hours, and we are masters of the world.
That 6-hour window, it really shows how precarious the plan was, even in his own mind.
It was all about that quick dash across the channel during the right tide, overwhelm the coastal defenses before the Royal Navy could fully react. High stakes. And this led to that huge, elaborate show at Boulogne from 1803 to 1805.
The invasion flotilla, all those flat-bottom barges we see in pictures, was that the real plan? Ferrying the Grand Army across in those?
Almost certainly not. They were a massive, very visible, very expensive feint. Hundreds of these small oar-powered boats. They couldn't have survived a fight with warships, probably couldn't even handle rough channel weather reliably.
So what was their purpose then?
To fix British attention. To make London panic, concentrate defenses on the Kent coast, keep the Royal Navy busy blockading the channel ports. It was a gigantic piece of misdirection.
While the real plan was something much more complex happening out in the Atlantic.
Exactly. The real plan was this incredibly ambitious naval combination. Napoleon's main battle fleet stuck in Toulon, Rochefort, Brest by the British blockade were supposed to break out.
Sail where?
The initial idea was often a rendezvous far away, maybe the West Indies, maybe off Spain at Faro. Unite into one massive fleet, 50 ships in the line perhaps, then suddenly sweep back north, overpower the British Channel Squadron, and hold the strait open for those crucial 6 hours for the flotilla.
That sounds incredibly difficult. Coordinating sailing fleets across thousands of miles with no radio, relying on wind and weather.
A nightmare. Especially for this French Navy, with all its problems, and especially against the British system.
The close blockade system, perfected under Jervis and St. Vincent.
Right. The British had what military strategists call interior lines. Think of Britain as the center of a wheel, and the French ports as points on the rim.
Okay.
The British blockading squadrons, those spread out watching Brest, Cadiz, Toulon, could communicate relatively quickly and concentrate faster on any threatened point. They were closer to the center.
Whereas the French fleets, to even break out and meet up.
They had to make these huge, eccentric movements, sail way out into the Atlantic, down to the Caribbean, just to avoid the blockaders. This made coordinating a rendezvous incredibly difficult, time-consuming, and prone to failure. The British could react faster than the French could combine.
Which is basically what happened in the run-up to Trafalgar. The French plan kept falling apart piece by piece, and Napoleon himself seemed to hinder it, always prioritizing maneuver over fighting.
Yes, this is a crucial point Mahan makes. Napoleon was obsessed with the grand combination, with getting his fleet to the Channel without a major battle if possible. He knew his fleet was fragile.
There's that example with Admiral Ganteaume at Brest.
Right. Ganteaume reports he might have a slight advantage, a chance to fight his way out past the blockading squadron. Napoleon tells him no sail without fighting.
Why? If the goal is to get out and join the others?
Because Napoleon saw his ships primarily as transports for the final invasion push. He couldn't afford to lose any in preliminary fights. He wanted the whole fleet preserved for that one moment in the Channel. This fear of losses, born from knowing his Navy's weaknesses, made him favor these complex, ultimately doomed maneuvers over decisive action.
And this put enormous pressure on Villeneuve again. He wasn't incompetent, but he saw the flaws all too clearly.
Villeneuve's tragedy was his realism. He was brave, he was skilled enough, but he knew. He knew his captains weren't reliable, his crews weren't trained for complex maneuvers or rapid gunnery. He knew Nelson was out there. This clarity, as Mahan says, absolutely sapped his power to take risks.
Leading to hesitation, indecision.
Exactly. He tried to follow Napoleon's complicated plan, break out from Toulon, sail to the West Indies, sail back. But weather, British pursuit, his own fleet's clumsiness, it all went wrong. He ended up retreating into Cadiz.
Setting the stage for Trafalgar.
Pretty much. The British blockades pinned them down. The French Navy's internal flaws made complex combinations impossible, and Napoleon's own strategic preferences prioritized evasion over engagement. Trafalgar, where Nelson smashed the combined fleet, was just the final, bloody confirmation of a failure that was baked in years before.
And after Trafalgar, the invasion threat was gone for good.
Completely gone. The French Navy, as a strategic force capable of challenging Britain for command of the sea, ceased to exist. Napoleon knew it, so the war had to shift. If he couldn't invade Britain, he'd try to starve it. #TAG-V, the economic war of exhaustion, 1806-1812.
Right, so Trafalgar closes the door on invasion. The war becomes purely economic, a contest of endurance. Napoleon turns inward, trying to use his control of Europe to strangle British trade.
This is his big shift, conquer the sea by the land. It starts formally with the Berlin Decree in 1806. He declares the British Isles under blockade.
Which was kind of absurd, wasn't it? A phantom blockade.
Utterly. He didn't have the ships to enforce it on the oceans. But the decree's teeth were on land. It forbade any country under French control or influence from trading with Britain. Any British goods found on the continent or any goods that had passed through Britain were declared forfeit, seizable.
What was the goal here? Just hurt British merchants?
It was deeper than that, yes, hurt their economy, but also forced Britain to change the rules of naval warfare. Napoleon argued it was unjust for Britain to seize private merchant ships at sea when armies on land weren't supposed to seize private property without compensation.
A clever political argument, trying to undermine the basis of British sea power.
Very clever.
Yeah.
But Britain's response was equally clever and ruthless. They used their actual control of the seas to turn Napoleon's system against him with the Orders in Council in 1807.
How did those work? They didn't just blockade France in return.
It was more sophisticated. Britain basically said, okay, neutral ships. If you want to trade with Napoleon's Europe, you must first stop at a British port. To be inspected, to pay transit duties, maybe buy a British license. Essentially, Britain inserted itself as the middleman for all European trade.
So instead of stopping trade, they decided to control it and profit from it.
Exactly. They turned Europe's need for overseas goods, sugar, coffee, cotton, timber, into British government revenue. It funded their war effort, subsidized their allies, and made life difficult and expensive for trade trying to reach France. It was a brilliant piece of economic judo.
Napoleon's system was rigid, trying to stop trade. Britain's was flexible, aiming to channel and tax it.
Precisely. And Napoleon's system hurt his own empire far more than it hurt Britain in the long run.
What about the French commerce raiding, though? The privateers, the frigates attacking British merchant ships, the guerre de course, didn't that cause significant damage?
It caused damage, yes. Mahan estimates maybe 11,000 British ships captured over the whole 21 years of war. Sounds like a lot.
It does.
But you have to see it in context. British merchant shipping doubled during the same period. Those 11,000 losses represent maybe 2.5% of Britain's annual sea traffic. It was an annoyance, a cost of doing business. Mahan calls it petty and inconclusive.
Like mosquito bites on an elephant, as you said earlier.
Pretty much. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy wasn't just swatting mosquitoes. It was denying France and its allies access to the entire world ocean. Their long-distance trade collapsed. Their industries starved for raw materials. That was the real economic stranglehold.
And enforcing Napoleon's continental system on Europe itself proved incredibly difficult, right? Even his own family resisted.
Oh, completely. It flew in the face of economic reality. His own brother, Louis, King of Holland, he basically ignored the decrees because enforcing them would have destroyed the Dutch economy, which lived on sea trade. Louis chose his Dutch subjects' welfare over Napoleon's grand strategy. That tells you something.
And beyond royal resistance, there was just massive smuggling.
On an epic scale, people need goods. Merchants need to trade. If the legal way is blocked, they find illegal ways. The British helped, of course. They set up places like Heligoland, this tiny island in the North Sea, as a giant warehouse for smuggled goods pouring into Germany.
And on the land borders, too.
Absolutely porous. There are accounts of like 6,000 people crossing between Altona and Hamburg every day, many of them involved in smuggling. Fierce clashes with customs officers were common.
That anecdote about the women hiding coffee.
Isn't that amazing? 500 or 600 women, apparently employed by Hamburg merchants, each smuggling maybe 14 pounds of coffee under their clothes. Coffee, sugar, cotton textiles. These things kept leaking through.
So the system wasn't starving Britain.
It was starving Europe.
Yeah.
And breeding corruption, resentment, undermining Napoleon's authority everywhere. It was fundamentally unstable.
And this instability, this need to plug the leaks, directly leads Napoleon to his fatal mistake, invading Russia in 1812.
It's the ultimate domino effect of the economic war. Tsar Alexander I of Russia saw the continental system wrecking his country's economy. Russia needed to export timber and grain, import colonial goods. The system hurt them badly.
So he started letting neutral ships trade again.
He refused Napoleon's demand to confiscate neutral ships, especially American ones, which were often carrying British goods under a neutral flag. Alexander basically said, I won't forbid neutral trade. My economy needs it.
And for Napoleon, that was unacceptable, a massive hole in his blockade.
A huge hole in the north. This direct clash over trade policy, combined with some other diplomatic fiction like Napoleon annexing Oldenburg, that became the trigger. Napoleon saw Alexander's refusal as defiance that had to be crushed.
So the invasion of Russia, the beginning of the end, was fundamentally driven by Napoleon's need to enforce his anti-British economic system. The Grand Army marched to enforce a sea blockade.
That's Mahan's core argument, and it's powerful. Sea power forced Napoleon into an impossible situation. He was already bogged down in Spain. The Spanish ulcer kept open and bleeding by British sea power, supplying Wellington through Portugal.
Right.
Now, on top of that, he decides he also has to invade Russia to enforce the blockade there. He splits his forces, violates the principle of concentration. He tries to conquer the sea by the land, and it leads him, as Mahan says, down the path of advance to certain ruin.
And underpinning all of this was the financial difference between Britain and France. This feels very modern.
It really is the bedrock of Britain's endurance. Napoleon's finances were, well, old-fashioned. He hated borrowing. He relied on looting conquered territories, accumulating treasure, direct contributions. It worked as long as he kept winning.
But if the conquest stopped...
The money stopped. His system was brittle, like a medieval king's war chest.
Whereas Britain's system...
was modern, based on two things. Vast global trade, protected by the Navy, generating huge tax revenues. And, crucially, a rock-solid system of public credit.
People trusted the British government to pay its debts.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The Bank of England, government bonds. Everyone knew Britain would pay the interest, even as the national debt soared. This confidence allowed Britain to borrow enormous sums relatively cheaply.
And use that money.
To fund its own war effort, and critically, to pay huge subsidies to keep continental allies Austria, Prussia, Russia in the fight against Napoleon. Napoleon had to conquer territory to pay his army. Britain could pay other countries' armies just by writing checks, backed by the long-term confidence generated by sea power and trade.
So Napoleon's power was aggressive, always needing to move forward. Britain's was defensive, patient, built on financial endurance.
Exactly. In a long war of exhaustion, the system built on credit and global commerce was always going to outlast the one built on conquest and plunder. Sea power bought Britain the time for its financial strength to grind Napoleon down. #TAG6 outro. So when you pull it all together, this whole deep dive, it really boils down to, well, maybe two core things that guaranteed the outcome. First, that catastrophic internal collapse of the French Navy right at the beginning. The loss of skill, the loss of discipline. It was fatal.
They never recovered from that initial blow.
Never really. And second, the simple, brutal economic reality. Sea power allowed Britain to control the global faucet, turn it off for France, keep it flowing for itself. That guaranteed Britain could outlast Napoleon financially until his own aggressive strategies forced him into fatal overreach.
It's such a powerful illustration of how constraints shape history. Napoleon's genius on land was undeniable. Pitt, the British Prime Minister, thought Britain would run out of money much sooner than it did.
He underestimated the resilience sea power provided.
But in the end, that sea power acted like a constant, invisible wall. It hemmed Napoleon in, forced him to divide his forces, chase these ultimately unobtainable goals like the Continental System, until he met his end not fighting Nelson on the waves, but retreating from Moscow, broken by distance, winter, and economic overstretch.
A victim of trying to fight a maritime power purely with land forces.
Yeah.
It couldn't work.
Which leaves us with a really interesting what if, doesn't it? What if? What if France, after the revolution, had somehow kept a truly professional, disciplined navy? One that could genuinely challenge the Royal Navy, maybe even just achieve temporary parity or superiority in the Channel for a few months.
How different would the 19th century look? Could Napoleon have succeeded with the invasion? Would France, not Britain, have become the dominant industrial power? Would the British Empire even have formed in the way it did?
A fascinating counterfactual to ponder. We'll leave you with that thought. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into exhaustion and empire.